Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education that inspires collaboration and action to help build a stronger, more resilient and more inclusive economy. This week we're bringing you our monthly Green Jobs Report, where we will look at which types of employment are being most impacted by job losses, the implications for communities and indeed for companies and investors and governments too. The latest figures from the US Department of Labor show new jobless claims still running at about 1.5 million per week, about 7 times the typical level over the last few years. Total unemployment, which is the blue narrow bars red on the right scale, is about 20 million or 13.4%. Meanwhile, the global COVID-19 outbreak continues more or less unabated. Despite success in flattening the curve in countries such as Italy, France, and Spain, and the UK and China, growth in other countries means that overall the trajectory is still upwards and there are second wave outbreaks emerging. Note that this chart is on a logarithmic scale. If we look on a linear scale, the extent of the US outbreak really stands out. In the United States, there are significant differences around the country. We've divided them into 3 groups, and there are 17 states that have succeeded in flattening the curve fairly effectively, although there are some indications of an uptick on the extreme right of this chart if you look closely. There are 13 states where case numbers are growing in a linear fashion, albeit with a more noticeable uptick on the right. And there are 16 states where case numbers really began to accelerate from the start of June. The other states have very low case numbers overall, so we have not included them in this analysis. As we know, all this translates into a significant impact on GDP, and the most recent figures from the IMF suggest an 8% contraction in advanced economies, only partly offset by a rebound the following year, and I wonder whether these figures may still prove to be optimistic. The outlook in emerging markets and developing economies is somewhat more positive. In the US, like many other countries, there has been some short-term support provided to help those most impacted, and this is added in many cases to ongoing budget deficits. This means that debt to GDP figures are increasing around the world. Meanwhile, in the United States, the budget deficits are forecast to remain large and growing, implying debt to GDP will escalate significantly well ahead of the highs seen as a result of the Second World War. And all this begs huge questions. Most importantly, perhaps, what's happening on the ground? Which types of jobs are being most impacted? What's happening to hourly wages and engagement rates? How are different communities being impacted? What lies behind the averages and headline figures? Building on this, should governments continue to provide support to mitigate the effects of the downturn? And how should that best be directed? Should they take the opportunity to invest in green infrastructure or promote green jobs? Should we really not care about debt to GDP figures at all? And what does all this mean for companies and investors? As we count down to the hour, please consider sharing ESGX with your friends and colleagues on social media. And if you're watching on YouTube, please like our channel. This really helps share our guests' important messages more broadly. Now, to answer these big questions, once again, we're joined by Dr. Fadhel Kaboub, President of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and his colleague Amir Khalegi, as well as Dr. Scott Fullwiler from the University of Missouri and Claudia Sahm from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. As always, our objective is for this live discussion to be as interactive as we can make it and you can make it. So please do introduce yourselves to each other via the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Post your questions in the Q&A. Share resources that you think are useful. We very much look forward to the discussion and thank you for joining us.